Hello and welcome to Lenny's Legends, where I, Sir Leonard I, will regale you with histories, mysteries, myths and legends. Today's story will focus on the Great Diamond Hoax of 1872, where we will discover how some of the wealthiest men of America and Europe were scammed out of hundreds of thousands of dollars. But before we begin, perhaps we should set the scene. The year was 1871. Picture a dusty San Francisco in the middle of a mining craze. In fact, mining speculation was sweeping the world. The roots of this speculation boom began all the way back in the Great Bonanza of the 1840s and the 1850s. Everyone wanted to be the one to find and finance the next big mining operation, from gold to diamonds and every precious mineral, metal and jewel in between. In 1871, the obsession with finding a new mine in America exploded. The Kimberley mine, also known as the Big Hole, was discovered in South Africa, and by 1872 the mine had become one of the most successful of the time. So, if South Africa could have such a diamond mine, then why couldn't America? Enter two industrious young men, cousins Philip Arnold and John B. Slack, a pair of smooth rascals who were about to command the attention of investors across America and Europe. Of the two, Arnold was a known miner who'd worked for several high-profile mining magnates in the San Francisco area. Not much is known about Slack, but the recorded feeling is that he was known as a plain man about town. In late 1871, the pair bought a sack full of precious gems to the office of one George D. Roberts, a mining magnate and financier who Arnold had previously worked under. They brought the gems to Roberts and made him swear not to tell anyone about them. But, of course, Roberts immediately told the president of the Bank of California, William Ralston, another financier and a friend of Roberts. At this point, word of a potential diamond field around San Francisco became the focus of local media attention. Ralston and Roberts wanted to be the ones to discover and capitalize on the diamond field, and managed to convince the two prospectors to allow them to investigate the field. So, two of Ralston and Roberts' men, who had practical mining experience, were sent to investigate the diamond mine claims. They returned with a report outlining the genuineness of the site and the potential wealth it could bring. By this stage, the initial investor group consisted of Ralston, Roberts, and their partner William M. Lent. Arnold and Slack made an agreement with the investors to bring them gems from the field so they could be further assessed and further valued. While this occurred, Roberts attempted to convince his longtime friend Asbury Harpending to manage the handling of the investigation and initial mining operations. At the time, Asbury was a wealthy financier who lived in London and had strong relationships with prominent financiers of the time. This included Baron Nathaniel Rothschild. Asbury was understandably reluctant to leave his comfortable life in England for a few harsh months of travelling the American wilderness. However, many European financiers became aware of the diamond mine rumours and sought further details from Asbury. This group included Rothschild. In a conversation with Rothschild, Asbury was convinced to investigate the potential mining site, as America was a large country not thoroughly surveyed and prospected at the time. So if there was a chance that a mine existed, then Asbury may as well investigate. So, in May of 1872, Asbury and his friend Alfred Rubery travelled to San Francisco. By this time, the prospectors had returned, but only with half of what they promised to the investors. They claimed that they had split the gems into two bags, but had lost one as they rafted across the river. In spite of not bringing the promised amount, the gems were still placed on display in the offices of a local jeweller, William Willis. This display was widely reported and led to a mass influx of investors, notably General Dodge, another partner of Lent. By this point, it was understood that Ralston, Lent, Roberts, Dodge and Asbury collectively owned 3/4 of the venture. It was agreed by the investors that they needed to have the diamonds officially verified, and so Asbury, being a well-known man with many connections, had the diamonds sent to world-renowned jeweller Charles Tiffany in New York, who quickly verified the gems and valued the small amount sent to him as $150,000. This meant that the total value of collected gems so far was around $1.5 million. This private valuation soon became widespread public knowledge and quickly spread amongst speculative circles. There was no shortage of investors. Now all the group needed was a mining expert. They chose a man called Henry Janin. He was known as a great mining consultant and engineer of the time. Many other mining conglomerates of the time were more than willing to base their fortunes on Janin's advice. and rumour had it that Janin had examined over 600 mines without making a single mistake, and had never cost his clients $1 due to bad judgment. If anything, Janin's only flaw was he was too conservative and therefore never took any chances. In short, Janin was known as the kingmaker of successful mines, so with his blessing, an operation was sure to be successful. As such, to join the project, Janin required $2,500 in cash, his expenses paid, and the right to take up to 1,000 shares of the stock in the venture at a nominal price. While some in the group protested against Janin's costs, in the end they hired him. After this final bit of business in New York, a group consisting of Arnold, Slack, Janin, Asbury, Rubery, and General Dodge set out to the diamond fields in the summer of 1872. On the way, they were met in Omaha by a group led by George D. Roberts, but Arnold complained that the more people who saw the fields would mean that the location and the wealth of the field could be leaked. In the end, Asbury sided with Arnold and managed to convince Roberts' group to be sent back to San Francisco. Arnold and Slack then led the group haphazardly and erratically from a small station near Rolling Springs to the purported fields. Oftentimes, the two prospectors seemed to be lost, but after 4 days of walking, the group pitched camp on the alleged diamond fields. The final location appeared to be one of the least frequented parts of the US, but despite the long zigzagging journey, some of the group believed they were actually only 25 miles parallel from the railroad. So when confronted with this, Arnold stated that the railroad had to be at least 100 miles away. Despite this, the excitement of the fields dispelled any uncertainty or doubts. As soon as the group dismounted their horses, they began to hunt for diamonds. Each member of the group rushed to find the first diamond, which was quickly found by Rubery along with many more riches. In the first hour of looking, diamonds, sapphires, rubies, and emeralds were found. The group were ecstatic. Janin especially, as while he was a man of good report with a fine reputation, such a discovery would cement his name, not to mention secure him the value of his given 1,000 shares. The rest of the group were intoxicated with dreams of their future wealth. They remained at the fields for the next few days, collecting more gems and performing more tests. Janin declared that this find would control the world's gem market. So, from there, the group, minus Arnold and Slack, decided to continue prospecting in the area and set up notices of claim to keep other potential finders away. When they returned to the fields, they left Slack and Rubery to guard the fields while the rest returned to New York. And this was actually the last time any of the investors ever saw Slack. Upon returning to New York in October, the group informed the other investors of the results of the expedition. Janin even bought a selection of the gems to Tiffany for further evaluation. And while at the time the group estimated them to be worth $20,000, Tiffany ended up valuing them at only $8,000. Now, some in the group ignored this and shrugged it off as a bear movement, being that Tiffany must have just been conservative in his valuation. From here, the news then became public that the diamond fields had been certified by Janin. And as such, Asbury then reported this to Baron Rothschild, that the rumours were true and that there was no doubt. This then exploded the interest of speculators, including Baron Rothschild, and it seemed as if the wisest of the Western world's financiers had solid evidence that the diamond fields were worth millions at a minimum. As such, many leading figures were eager to associate themselves with the investors group. The group, under Ralston's pressure, then decided that the venture should be headquartered in San Francisco, with branch offices in New York. So quickly, Ralston organised a company under Californian laws and established the San Francisco and New York Mining and Commercial Company, with a capital stock of $10 million divided into 100,000 shares. The company prepared assets so that it had every piece of every step of the diamond production process, from mining and cutting to preparing for market stalls. All in all, 25 financiers, including an agent of Rothschild, were allowed to buy $80,000 stock each and gave the company a cash injection of $2 million held with the Bank of California. Arnold and Slack's interest in the venture was then sold out by a payment of $300,000 given to Arnold personally. This added to previous amounts given to the pair, which totaled $360,000. Whilst the company finalised its ownership of the Diamond Fields territory, media outlets went wild and speculated the exact location and value of the fields, with one outlet alleging that it knew the exact location and had in its possession a single gem taken, which was larger than a pigeon egg and worth at least $500,000. However, this bout of success was not to last long. On the 11th of November, the president of the mining company received a telegram from one Clarence King, which in short terms explained that the whole matter was a fraud and that the fields were clearly salted, meaning they'd been clearly faked. King had heard about the fields, and on the 2nd of November he'd managed to be guided there, and he had found gems that appeared to have been refined. It soon became clear to him that the natural gems were actually refined gems from another location that had been used to salt the site. King quickly returned to the railroad and sent his telegram on to the financiers. King's message outlined that the investors, and notably Henry Janin, had been the victims of an unparalleled fraud. The message went on to explain that upon travelling to the fields, King had studied the boundaries of the claim site and begun to assess the distribution and mode of occurrence of the gems. King explained that he began his assessment at the site where the investor had discovered their batch of gemstones, and that after a day of assessment, King himself would have been confident in the genuineness of the site. However, on the second day, King made several key discoveries. The first, in 9 out of 10 examples, the gemstones were directly on hard rock surfaces, in crevices, or in the crust of the soil that held signs of being disturbed within the last year or so. The second point, gemstones were found with other naturally occurring deposits, notably quartz and iron. If the gems were a natural deposit, then they would settle alongside other deposits throughout the earth down to the bedrock. But when King dug down to the bedrock, he was unable to find any gemstones below the top layers of soil. Reason 3. Ruby distribution did not follow the natural formations in the site, and remained in a specific area which showed clear signs of being disturbed. The fourth reason. A microscopic analysis of the rock in the site did not reveal any grain of gemstones. Point 5. Ant hills near the site were assessed and deemed to be man-made and constructed to look like an ant hill. This is because ants would use small pebbles to create their hills, and therefore would also use any gemstones on the top layer of soil to make their hills. Point 6. King discovered diamonds, rubies, garnets, spinels, sapphires, emeralds, and amethysts at the site, and it's very unlikely, if not impossible, that these would naturally occur in the same location and in the same quantities found. Point 7. The areas outside of the site were assessed, including flanking canyons, and no gemstones were found, thus proving the salting of the field. King was so impressed in how convincing the site was that he wasn't surprised that Janin was fooled, especially as Janin had not been allowed to perform a detailed excavation. The site was then re-examined by the investors with King and Janin present. The sparkling ant hills, once kicked, clearly showed that they were fakes, with gemstones neatly placed at the bottom of each. On the 25th of November, King reached San Francisco, and it became a widespread and accepted fact that the diamond fields were fraudulent. Shortly after this, news came from London stating that the diamonds sent there were worthless and originated from South Africa, and had been purchased a year ago in bulk from South Africa by a dealer who had recognised the gems. So how did the fraudsters pull this off? Shortly after this, a man named William B. Cooper came forward, claiming that he was the architect of the plan and that he discussed the fraud with Arnold and Slack nearly 2 years before Janin had investigated the site. Cooper claimed that salting fields with gold and silver was an overdone practice, and that diamond salting would be a fine variation, as rough diamonds used for mining tools could be used for it. Cooper stated that he was an advisor to the plot, and even gave Arnold and Slack rough mining gems, which were then mixed with other rough gems such as rubies. These gems were the initial gems used by Arnold and Slack to convince Roberts, which kick-started the entire hoax. Cooper came forward now and revealed all of this as he claimed he was also a victim, as Arnold and Slack had left San Francisco after their successful fraud without paying Cooper anything. So how else was the fraud funded? Prior to 1870, Arnold had made some capital selling mines and making around $50,000. This money was then used to buy diamonds in Amsterdam and London. It's considered that Arnold made 2 trips to Europe to buy gems, avoiding American ports and sailing from Halifax instead. His first visit was in the fall of 1870, after the hoax had begun, where he travelled to Amsterdam and bought coarse stones from various institutions. Some of these gems were used to bolster the hoax and convince investors that their mine was genuine, and others were used to pre-salt the mining fields. In the second trip, Arnold travelled to London around early winter of 1872, and went to one of the largest dealers of coarse stones and bought $15,000 to $20,000 worth of cheap gems. These gems were then used to salt the site further and to ensure that the investors would be convinced once they visited the site in the coming summer. All in all, it was estimated that the scammers had spent around $35,000 salting the mine with gems to establish their fraud, leaving them with an estimated $600,000 in net profit. So what happened next? Well, Arnold took his share of the profit and returned to Kentucky, where he bought a large piece of land which he kept well guarded. It's unclear what the split between Arnold and Slack exactly was. Arnold stated that he had $550,000 in his safe, but it's not clear how much of this came from the scam or from his previous mining career. A lawsuit was brought against Arnold and his property for $350,000. Arnold refuted claims that he had salted the site, and he used Janin and Tiffany's reports, along with popular media reports from the time, to show that he had given the investors credible diamonds and that the site must have been salted after the examination by Californian scamps. This catapulted Arnold's fame in his local area, as people were impressed by his spunk, that a southerner could go into Yankee territory and bring home more than $500,000 in spoils. Old war feelings made Arnold the hero of the hour, and living in Kentucky with such renown also meant he was protected by ex-Confederates. Asbury speculated that these men who were protecting Arnold were made up of mostly ex-cavalrymen who served under Brigadier General John Hunt Morgan, who had become known as the Morgan's Raiders. The legal proceedings against Arnold dragged on, and eventually Arnold gave around $150,000 back to the investors with the condition that he be given immunity from any further litigation. After this was settled, Arnold then opened a bank in his hometown. This angered local businesses to the point where Arnold encountered one rival on the street. The two got into a gunfight, and while Arnold managed to wing his rival, he was shot in the shoulder with buckshot. This didn't kill him, however, he was soon struck with a bout of pneumonia, which killed him in the winter. Now, the dates for this are a bit confusing. According to Asbury, this event occurred in 1873. However, other sources indicate that this actually happened in 1878, and that Arnold died in early winter of 1879, aged 49. Many attempts were made to locate Slack, but none were successful. It appeared that Arnold held most, if not all, of the money which they'd made from the mine. Asbury speculated that Slack may have been murdered, but Slack may have also lived a quiet life, with some sources suggesting he died in New Mexico in 1896 of a heart attack, aged 76. The losses of the scam fell on the shoulders of the original dupes, being Ralston, Lent, Dodge, Roberts, and Asbury. So Lent ended up keeping the $150,000 that was given back by Arnold, as this had covered his entire interest in the matter. But it's unclear if he shared any of this with Dodge, his business partner, and nothing else is known about Dodge after this point. Ralston paid back the 25 stockholders their initial investments in full, and he also bore the brunt of the $300,000 paid to Arnold and Slack. He later died in 1875 while swimming. It's unclear if this was suicide or an accident. Any remaining losses fell on Asbury and Roberts, but it's unclear how much this was. After revealing the diamond fraud, King became very well known amongst the public and became a key figure in the US Geological Surveys. He continued his work as a geologist, and in 1879 was made director of the USGS. In the last 13 years of his life, he fell in love with an African-American former slave called Ada Copeland. Interracial marriages were discouraged and in some places illegal, so King convinced Ada that despite him being white, that he was African American as well. He never revealed his true identity as Clarence King to Ada until he was on his deathbed in 1901, where he died from tuberculosis. And Henry Janin, his reputation was harmed by the incident, but he very quickly returned to being known as a reliable mining engineer. He even bought back the stock that he had sold at the height of the bubble to ensure his name was preserved. So, even though all the endings have been given, there's still more to discuss. Following the bursting of the bubble, the media and the public began to speculate on whether some of the investors were actually a part of the scam. And everyone was suspected, even Ralston, who had lost hundreds of thousands of dollars and his reputation. Ultimately, however, the people, especially the people of San Francisco, decided that the secret mastermind was Asbury. In the minds of the public, both at the time and decades after the events, Asbury was thought to be involved, and he was thought to be the fourth fraudster. So much so that in 1912, John Philip Young published his second volume on the history of San Francisco, where he briefly covers the diamond hoax and notably records Asbury as the genius by whom it was evolved and elaborated. But why is Asbury's involvement doubted? Well, this comes from a few distinct sources. So the first being, Asbury had been associated with similar mining scams before, notably the Emma mining incident. The second point, Asbury's influence expanded knowledge of the whole event. He stoked the fires of the hoax and helped it get to its greatest heights. And the third point, in his own account, in his book, The Great Diamond Hoax and Other Stirring Incidents in the Life of Asbury Harpending, Asbury omits key details. Throughout his account, he names others as greater fools and dupes and goes into unnecessary detail to make himself appear innocent, and then also omits key details about figures such as Clarence King, his worth as a geologist, his abilities, his findings, and it's an interesting balance between potential fact and gossip. For instance, on Henry Janin, Asbury alleges that Janin made money off his sale of the shares at the height of the hoax, but then does not mention that Janin bought back his shares for the same value after the hoax was revealed. So, was Asbury involved? Well, overall, he comes across as another victim. Perhaps at times a willing one, but we cannot forget that everyone involved was well versed in mining operations and precious gems. And several of the key victims were lifelong miners. Janin was an expert engineer in this field, and not once did any of them seem to fully question the luck that they had had and the impossibility of several distinct gemstones appearing together. We also cannot forget Tiffany and William Willis's involvement. Tiffany being the New York-based jeweller, William Willis was the San Francisco jeweller where the diamonds were initially displayed. So both of these professional jewellers had seen the rough gemstones, and it's quite unclear why they did not see that the gems were poor quality and they likely originated from South Africa. Now, Tiffany did value a collection of the diamonds, initially estimated to be $20,000 by the investors as $8,000, but on another point, why didn't he see that they were just rough, blunt diamonds that were used for drills? We know that the fields were salted with $15,000 worth of diamonds, so $8,000 for a few handfuls still seems to be a much higher price than they should be. But of course, Tiffany's reputation was very much hurt by this, and it was a source of issue in the years following, and it was quickly kind of buried by other events at the time. A final thing to consider is that a diamond mine was actually discovered relatively close to the site a few decades later. So this was the Crater of Diamonds State Park, discovered in 1906, and then decades later, in modern times, in 1996, the Kelsey Lake diamond mine was discovered in Colorado, thus proving that the diamond speculation bubble and the idea that there could be diamonds in America was not too inconceivable. Well, that was a fun story about investor greed and the ingenuity of confidence-based tricksters. I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did researching it. One thing that I would like to touch on is that the sources for this story have been rather inconsistent on small and specific details. So for this episode, we have largely relied on Asbury's autobiography. As previously noted, he is not the most reliable source, particularly regarding key details and exact dates. However, he is the only major party to provide a first-hand description of the events in full, even though he wrote this book decades after the events actually happened, and in response to Philip Young's book on the history of San Francisco. So sources on the exact costs of the fraudsters buying diamonds also seem to conflict, as do dates for when people travelled to places, both in America and in Europe. if you want more information, we do encourage you to read around the subject and come to your own conclusions. So to help with this, we have some useful links in the description. Well, that's all we have time for today. I hope you've enjoyed this story and that you come back for another. Thank you for your time. Until the next legend.